Welcome back, everybody. It's been a little while. My name is Matthew McQuilla, and I'm here again with Professor Larry Cotter to discuss his book, Hong Kong Between One Country and Two Systems. Today, we are discussing chapter 27, inaugurating the new era for Hong Kong with the national security law and the cancellation of the Tiananmen Vigil. This was written Monday, June 1st, 2020. How are you doing today, Professor Backer?
Oh, just fine. I'm sorry that it's taken us so long to finish this project up, but hopefully um, it it will. People are still continuing to be interested in the progression. We're near the end, of course, the progression of the story of Hong Kong from pre protest to post protest, which is sort of where we're getting to.
And yeah, you're right. We move on to the end of the book, and we have like different stages in the book. We have planning, we have opportunities for both sides to really feel each other out, and then we have action. I feel as though this was a chapter more so of us really reorienting ourselves on watching the actions take place. Can you tell the people a little bit about this chapter?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right to pick up on that. Although I might phrase it just a little bit differently. Between June of 2019 and COVID, the active actors were the protesters, and the site for action was on the streets of Hong Kong, as well as conceptually with the supporters and the like. But that was really the main thrust. With COVID, there's this period of realignments. Everyone understands that there's something very new in the mix. And we talked about this before, and that everyone's strategy is changing. And in this context, it was the central authorities and the local authorities, much more than the protesters, who were able to seize the opportunities presented by this fundamental change in the context in which the interactions between protesters and officials were taking place, and then to exploit it for their benefits. And in a sense, for the protesters, the big failure there had been the inability to understand how profoundly important COVID was, especially with respect to what had been their successful strategy, effectively of controlling physical space, where now access to physical space could be blocked precisely because of the health of the people who were going out. And so we saw how that worked. And then after COVID, it was the state and the officials who became much more active. And here it wasn't in the context of controlling the streets so much as in actually activating now what they'd already started in June and July, and that is controlling the conceptual rather than the physical space of Hong Kong, and to do it not just with respect to narrative that was in the first half, but now with respect to the structures of law and lawmaking. And having that occur, right, that occurs all the way through the end of May, and the announcement and rolling out of both the national security and the national anthem laws that we'll talk about in a bit, but also then beginning to make good on it. And here's where the active part comes out, because it isn't just once you occupy conceptual space, then you need the gestures. You need key critical gestures, I think, that then drive home the point. And that was the starting point for this essay was, well, something that had been a core part of and a manifestation of Hong Kong's difference within China, the protection of their memorialization of the Tiananmen incident every year, which of course would have been impossible in the mainland. Now that is targeted, and that goes. And it goes in a way that sort of implicates the new regime without actually necessarily full frontally invoking the new regime itself. And so that was kind of the starting off point for what then winds up being something a little different.
So can you tell us the significance of, I guess, further tell us the significance of them restricting this activity?
Well, it was at this point that one begins to see that things that were taken for granted, those gestures, signs, symbols, activities, those mindsets that kept distinguishing Hong Kong legal culture, Hong Kong political culture from the mainland, are now going to start being stripped away. And that was critically important, of course, given the different narratives of sovereignty, right? For the central authorities to do that was to effectively, significantly weaken the sources through which the Hong Kong protesters, or, you know, and we've talked about this before, the constellation of protesters, a lot of them were loosely aligned. There wasn't a protester, there were a variety of different camps, where there was at least some convergence in the difference of Hong Kong, that those are now going to be stripped away. And it becomes much harder to argue that you are singularly different when you are no longer the sources of that difference, especially in terms of political culture, get stripped away. The idea being that eventually, once it's stripped away, and once these performances of difference are taken away for a long enough period of time, that there will be no basis for doing that. And I suspect that that was part of what was going on here. But then what I do is I looked at this, and I looked at this gesture making, and then I thought, well, what if I teleported myself out from, because then of course this goes back to not just the construction of the protester autonomy, but it goes back to the fundamental construction of the protections of the Sino-UK Joint Declaration, which was supposed to be running through 2047, and clearly was not going to be running through 2047 in the same way as it had been before 2019. You know, what does one make of this? Because we're not only now moving quite actively against the protester conceptualizations after the 5 demands, but you're also making a critical thrust against the internationalist camp by effectively saying, or acting as if this the Sino-UK Joint Declaration, and certainly the protections through 2047 just stop. And they stop way early. And so I thought, well, you know, if we look at this, it's easy to get lost in the moment, but can we project ourselves from this moment to the year, I forget what year,
2120.
Yeah, 2120, right, to the year 2120. And if I were looking back at this from 2120, now stripped of the emotion, stripped of the immediacy, this is what happened to great, great, great grandma, rather than to me. And so there's a detachment that comes from it. What might I see? And that's sort of the bulk of my thoughts in this essay, was actually trying to think through that.
And you know, I think I found that to be the most interesting part of this chapter, how perspective determines history, how perspective can determine how we learn or how we're educated on history. And that goes far past just this one incident. I think it speaks to a lot of things within our own civil society, and how we learn our past is based off a vantage point. So I did think that was a very creative way of showing that to the reader.
That's right. And you know, this isn't unique to Hong Kong. The Americans, all us, have been engaged in something of a similar project as we go back and look at our histories, and we revisit histories that were written much closer to the event, and then now from an increasingly distant, temporally distant perspective, are not reimagining, but reapproaching events, not just their facticity, that is what actually occurred, but the way in which those facts are narrated or arranged so that we can draw insights from them. And the insights that we might have drawn, for example, in 1868 about the Civil War, will be very different from the insights now that a century or century and a half or a century and a half and more, 2021, looking back to 1868 or 1865 would give us. And, and that's a process. And clearly we're not in 2120. And we have no idea what's going to happen between now and then. That may also, because this moving forward both can clarify, but it can also substantially cloud what has happened before because of all the intervening events. So, a number of quite interesting, dramatic, tragic, or wonderful things might have occurred between 2021, now we're in 2022 and 2120, that then provides a very different view of what went on in 2019, 2020 than just teleporting ourselves there with nothing intervening. And so assuming that away, I said, okay, let me look at it and in the process kind of use this to begin wrapping up a first cut and an exercise of a detached first cut at what we have just experienced over the course of a year, where we started and where we ended.
I guess the way I processed that while reading it was because I like to look at sports. It would be like determining a winner or loser the day of the game, and then coming back to the game 10 years later and saying, the results weren't as concrete as we believe them to be, and reestablishing almost new boundaries and rules to what occurred 10 years ago, and determining sometimes a new winner, but also maybe giving a different story to how we got to the outcome that we got. So I thought that was well thought out. Is there anything else that you'd like to add for the readers in this chapter?
Yeah, no, but that was absolutely right. And I was going to underline that. That's an excellent way of approaching this, with one addition, that our ability, that the way we look at the thing 10 years after, 10 seasons after, will almost inevitably be informed by what occurred during those additional 10 seasons that may have helped us reshape, clarify. So it's not just detachment, but the clarity that comes from then watching things occur thereafter. And I think both of them are necessary. I was able to do one, which is the detachment of 100 years, but of course I can't predict all of the perhaps interesting, weird, wonderful, tragic, or horrible, or glorious things that will occur that may be useful between now and 2120. So that's a caveat. And so the big, and this is where I'll leave you. So when I looked at this, I said, aha, if I look at this, and so we can end actually sort of where we begin, when you look at 2019 to 2020, and you look at the context, even through the filter of the Sino-UK Joint Declaration, what you wind up seeing is two extraordinarily different phases in the reassimilation of Hong Kong into and within China. And that these two phases, I think 100 years from now, are going to be far, far clearer than they are now, irrespective of the granularity of the Sino-UN, the Sino-UK Declaration, but certainly with respect to the way that was used to approach relations. So in the first phase, which lasted, I think, to the end of 2019, and then that was its big critical risk point of moving forward or being defeated, and it turns out it's defeated. But that first phase might be understood as the internationalist phase of the Hong Kong transition, or the Hong Kong reassimilation into China. You start from a colonial baseline, you cede the colonial structures, but you don't cede it back to another state. You instead cede it to an internationalist, a transnational structure or framework through which the people of Hong Kong can then operate. And what they do with it, certainly in 1997, you had no idea. In retrospect, the central authorities and the people who are sympathetic to the position of the central authorities would be taking the position that indeed what the UK did in moving to an internationalist camp was to try to stack the deck to make transition harder, Those who don't share that view would say, well, it actually made sense that in the context of a transition, and certainly given the context of 1997, when the globe was moving, or at least the vanguard elements of what was going to become globalization was moving towards an internationalist-based convergence of governance norms, it made perfect sense to experiment on it or with it by using Hong Kong as a sort of model of a transition from a state-based to an internationalist-based management of the constituting structures of a region that is distinct from that with which it shares sovereignty. So that was that first phase of moving forward in ways that became increasingly difficult for the central authorities to bear. And the reason for that is, of course, China was very different in 2019 than it was in 1997, an extraordinary progress conceptually, mentally, culturally, as well as economically and physically. And that kind of internationalism, which may have started as something positive, even in the eyes of the central authorities, becomes increasingly viewed as a barrier. Because at that point, a barrier leading to a nexus point or a decision point, either Hong Kong is going to be governed by someone other than the central authorities, although it remains a sovereign part of China, or it isn't, right? And that inflection point, in a sense, occurs in 2019 and 2020. And in that actually starts the second phase, which might be viewed as the national phase of the Hong Kong transition. So we use the internationalist phase to embed norms, international norms to some extent, as we transition out of colonialism. At 2019, a series of events occur that require decisions. Could it have lingered through 2047, which would have been the natural place where the second nationalist phase of transition would have occurred? Sure, but given the nature of what goes on in Hong Kong, in this internationalist phase, time moved up, right? And so it wasn't 2047, it was 2019, and that was in the hands, just, the serendipity of events. And perhaps by 2021, we'll see there was no serendipity. It was inevitable that not only there's an acceleration, but that this is occurring. And then we have the nationalist phase. And the nationalist phase, of course, is one where we move from the primacy of the international law and norms as the baseline against which you judge the legitimacy of the structures and governance of Hong Kong, to one where you substitute the political economic model and the political economic authority of the nation for that of the international community. And this is one in which we move from an absorption of Hong Kong within international space to a reabsorption of Hong Kong within domestic space. And that makes all the difference in the world. And that, I think, hopefully will make the chapter interesting enough for our readers to go and read my take on what all of this means from the perspective of 2120. But ultimately, at the end, what it suggests is that 2047, by 2019, 2047 became absolutely untenable, either for the internationalists or for the nationalists. And so there it was. And with the abandonment of 2047, we also abandoned, to some extent, the strict structures of the Sino-UK Joint Declaration. And we either, at that point, move it into this really unknown and untested realm of domestic internationalism, or we move back into the more well-worn and well-understood notion of nationally based autonomy, limited by the overarching political constitutional structures of the nation rather than of the international community. And hopefully this will whet everyone's appetite and you'll read the chapter.
Well, I hope so as well, and I think that it will. I found this chapter to be quite insightful and interesting. So I think that to all our readers out there, this is one chapter to be on the lookout for. But there's what 32 chapters to be on the lookout for, and because of that, we will be having the last couple of these chapters coming to you soon and very soon. If there's anything else you would like to add, feel
No, just
warm
the
to.
usual, buy the book.
All right, you heard it here first from the man. First, second, third, and 27th time. Buy the book. All right, well, thank you again for your time, and I hope that everyone out there is having a good beginning to your summer or spring. All right, you have a good Easter.
Thank you. You too.
All right.